You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Lockhart, Texas, the barbecue capital of Texas, which basically makes us the barbecue capital of the world, right? On this episode today, I've got a fellow Texan, a man that I've been listening to, watching his YouTube streams, and reading his Substack for quite some time. I love his content. You guys are going to like him too. Our favorite frogman. If you watch this on YouTube, you'll see, and a lot of you are very familiar with the Prudentialist, and you'll know his famous frog avatar. I've actually seen him do some stuff where it really shows, where he shows himself too. So I don't know where we delineate which episodes show the real man or which ones show the infamous frogman. I do love the backdrop he's got here on this episode. I hope you're watching it on the YouTube premiere, and these come out every Tuesday evening, as you know, at 7 p.m. Central Time. Sometimes we switch that up. Buck, what's the best way to know if we switch that up? Well, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel. You'll get all the notifications. And like I said, he's got a Substack too. I know a lot of you are familiar with his YouTube channel. The Prudentialist.substack.com is where he writes. He writes on culture, observations on the world, international relations in more detail, and the occasional poem or two. He's a simple man trying to make sense of what he sees, perhaps offer some suggestions and discuss the things going on in a way that isn't feuds, drama, or mindless grifting. That is for sure. He is none of those things. He's a very brilliant, very articulate young man, an Orthodox Christian, and a fellow Texan. And now, welcome to the show for the first time. I'm really excited to have the Prudentialist on, but we will call him Matthew for today. Matt, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm doing great. Happy to be on. Thanks for the invitation.
You bet. You do a lot of writing, a lot of live streaming, podcasting, all of these things. I think most of my audience is going to be familiar with you, but go ahead, give an intro of what you think they will find pertinent, and then we'll jump off from there.
Sure. So as I like to describe myself, both on sort of Substack and everywhere I go, sort of just writer, fisherman, cultural commentator, and Orthodox Christian above all those things. So I cover a variety of topics ranging from sort of media ecology, how a lot of the Marshall McLuhan stuff, how things affect us. I cover international relations and geopolitics alongside just usual American culture and politics. If any of your fans or listeners are watchers of The Blaze, they'll see me as a pretty recurring guest on the Orrin McIntyre show. We have a running gag where I'm his quote-unquote most restrained extremist. It's a lot of fun that way. And that's what I do. You can find me on Substack, Twitter, and all sorts of places.
The fact that voices, I mean, I've been in and around these dissident circles, I guess you could say, for 20-something years. And, you know, I had my blue-pilled Reason magazine libertarian phase. But even back then when I was kind of in that was still, you know, certainly outside of the mainstream of what was going on back then. And it seems like that there's been somewhat of a tide shift. I mean, the fact that you can get on to The Blaze on Orrin McIntyre's show, who's a feature on The Blaze, is, I think it's optimism. It gives me optimism. And have you seen this tide change? Do you get more listeners flocking to stuff that you're doing now?
There's certainly been, my friend Dave the Distributist likes to call it the quote-unquote vibe shift. Something has definitely changed. And I guess I try to be very skeptical of that feeling, because I have to ask myself how much of this is because it's an election year versus how much of this is genuine progress. I mean, I wouldn't call myself the most, you know, dissident person that Orrin's had on. I like to think that someone like Morgoth's Review is far more appropriate for that title. But I do sense that there has been a great popularization of ideas that maybe 6 or 7 years ago would have been verboten. I mean, to see Charlie Kirk talk about demographic change, or even in his milk toast watered down way of talking about the gay race communist that was Martin Luther King Jr. is a sign that, hey, bullying works and pressuring these people to talk about these issues do work. So I see a sense where there could be optimism, but I also know, and I'm sure you do and your listeners do as well, is that throughout the history of sort of any sort of conservative movement in the United States, there has always been a desire to contain things.
Yes.
Right now, I've been reading the New Right Papers, which was edited and put together by Robert Whitaker, and reading what these guys were doing in the 70s, 80s, just the whole Reagan Revolution, and it feels very similar to what we were doing. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what happened to these guys? And then you read Pat Buchanan's Where the Right Went Wrong and how it was all co-opted. And so I think it's important that if any lesson is to be learned from all this is that, yes, the momentum is good, but the reins need to be taken. The reins need to be seized, and we need to start setting our course for our own direction.
Paul Gottfried speaks about and has written a lot about how there was some sort of gatekeeping. And even in the Buchanan, when Buchanan was big, not Buchanan himself, but there were elements in the right that were pushing out still people like Sam Francis and Paul Gottfried. So I think having that knowledge now that a lot of us understand that did happen, at least it should be more obvious if it starts to happen now. And I think more of us can be aware of it, which is also a good sign.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the first things I was reading in the New Right Papers was this discussion about mailers and trying to bypass the press and talking to them, which anytime you're trying to bypass the mainstream media, that's the process of disintermediation. You're trying to cut out the middleman and talk to the consumer directly. And then you read someone like Nick Land and his Xenosystems essays, and he's like, well, disintermediation is inherently anti-regime or anti-cathedral. And I listened to that, and I'm like, well, Twitter allows you to do these things. The blogosphere allows you to do these things. And so there's great pleasure to that, and not just the pleasure of knowing that I can get more views on something than someone from, say, the National Review, but more importantly, that you also have a sense of optimism that, well, the way that I can be intermediated has radically changed. But at the same time, it's also become far more centralized than just, say, 3 or 4, broadcast television channels. I mean, 30 years ago, right, you could have anyone, including Sam Francis, be on C-SPAN. Now, almost nobody watches C-SPAN anymore. We're paying attention to YouTube or the Twitter sphere or the alt-zine space, wherever you want to hang out. And that does have its problems because now we're so disintermediated, we're so spread out and decentralized, it's hard for one place to have the central platform where we do it. And we've kind of reinvented the wheel of the news podcaster, the platformer. We don't need Walter Cronkite or anyone to tell us what to do. I now have my select people of dissident or right wing or whatever podcasts you want to listen to. And sometimes, again, with ideas, you never know where that idea may have been original, may have been co-opted somewhere. So we live in a new media environment, but we do have history as a firm guide for where to go.
What do you guys do over? I've never asked someone this that's come on this show, even when they take part in the Old Glory Club. Can you talk about what y'all do at the Old Glory Club? What that is?
Yeah, sure. So it's both the media side, the Substack and the YouTube channel has essays by club members as well as guest writers to sort of talk about the American tradition, American history, as well as what's going on in the world, but also to just cover day-to-day politics. That's what Pony Express Radio is every Thursday evening. But the primary purpose of the organization is to promote sort of camaraderie and Americanism. So we have, chapters that are across the United States and Florida, New England, and Virginia and other places where just guys can get together and realize that they're not atomized, that they're not alone, and that they can do something productive in their own communities and histories. I mean, some of the stuff that our Virginia chapter has done has been a lot focused on, a lot of community cleanup projects and things like that. I mean, it's just a place where men can get together and not be alone. It's not explicitly political. It's not for political activism. I think a lot of people have learned their lesson when it comes to things like, the Proud Boys or whatever. But it is a place primarily to let people know you're not alone and that there are projects that can be done, such as, cleaning up the graves of, say, Confederate soldiers or even our American servicemen and so on. Because if someone doesn't preserve this kind of history and preserve our traditions, well, who's going to do it? And as we've learned, blatantly with the Robert E. Lee statue just earlier at the end of last year, they have no problem doing the erasure of history, just in the same way we've seen in every other regime change happen across the world, that they really will throw and burn down your idols, even if they were meant for reconciliation.
Yes, well put. I've been doing, I won't call it a trend, but several episodes on, let's say, the weakness of the regime, the crumbling of it, the civilizational decline, and things of this nature. And I want to get your thoughts on where are we as far as, let's say, the spirit of this age, I don't know, the fourth turning, the end of the regime as we've known it for at least our lifetimes, entering a darker time. Where are we as far as this historical moment goes in your mind?
Well, I mean, that question does vary from person to person you ask.
Yes.
I did a video not too long ago called Meteorologists for the Eschaton, because I feel like almost every individual's take on the strength of the regime or its fragility and so on are all predicated on when do you think the big thing's going to happen, whether it's the fourth turning or some kind of collapse scenario, or as Charles Haywood likes to describe, which you recently had him on, was a really good episode, the sort of fracturing. It's entirely dependent on when your timeline is for that moment to hit. And so regardless of when it comes, as I said in that video, I referenced the late Father Thomas Hopko, the master wants to see you working. So regardless of whenever it happens, you should be doing things to prepare for your, that inevitable fracture. You should be ensuring that, you and your family or a network of friends have the means and tools to go on with that. I don't know when that might come through, and I don't know when it'll happen. However, I do see a few things on the horizon that I feel like are pretty guaranteed. One of them, of course, is definitely going to be the floor will come out from under us, economically speaking. I don't think America ever truly recovered from 2007 and 2008, and I'm sure you're about a decade or so older than me, so you would definitely know that's definitely the case, right? We never recovered from the Great Recession, right. the big sad, as 2.0, as some people like to say.
There was a lot of Band-Aids and heroin injected.
Oh yes, yeah, a lot of Band-Aids, a lot of heroin, a lot of fentanyl nowadays, unfortunately. That's definitely the case. So I would imagine that eventually the floor will give out from under us, economically speaking, and I feel like it's already begun, and the media and the press are lying through their teeth and pumping up numbers to make that look like it's not the case, because we never recovered from 2008. We certainly haven't recovered from the mess of our COVID stimulus, and now you add on the war in Ukraine, the ongoing crisis in the Red Sea, and then the Panama Canal, which has been dealing with low water levels and a huge backlog. Our entire system was predicated on just convenience. And if there's one thing about convenience, is that convenience is never anti-fragile. It's never resilient. Right. You sacrifice resiliency for convenience. So by doing so, we have made ourselves incredibly vulnerable. So some economic, recession, most likely a depression, I foresee happening sometime in the future. I don't know when. I did not study economics. That's definitely one issue. And I mean, again, I think we're going to see the continual ratchet turn in blue states versus red states on anarcho-tyranny. That's just an inevitability. It's a great tool. It's been working for decades now. And I mean, when the governor of New York is literally having press conferences saying, listen, this whole Trump case is not going to affect the rest of the real estate community. We're just going after one guy. Everyone who has a brain and maybe has a slight disagreement with this particular government or administration knows that they have to jump ship. So again, the ratchet will turn more on those issues. So I mean, just the continued applied pressure of leftist lawfare and economic deterioration. Those are the two things I definitely see on the horizon. But as for any big event happening, I mean, I don't think anyone predicted October 7th, right? When it comes to the ongoing conflict in Palestine with Israel. I don't see that happen. I didn't see anyone talk about that as a for sure flare up. So I mean, anything could happen.
Yeah, it seems like the only people that knew that was going to happen were in charge of Israel.
Yeah.
You wrote a wonderful piece about Reenchantment, and one of the reasons I appreciate it, other than I think your writing style is really good, and the topics within that were fascinating, but there is a bit of a pessimism, I think, within our circles and even more broadly speaking. And I think it's natural, because if we're sitting here watching shows like this or listening to shows or reading things, it's like, well, this bad thing could happen, or here's what's going on that's bad. there is this human instinct to say, well, there's nothing I can do. And so then you start to roll into what I would term nihilism, the spirit of nihilism, which is what Father Seraphim Rose wrote about. But do you see that as well? Is that part of why you wrote this, or are we all optimistic? Do you see a problem with negativity in some of our circles?
Primarily, I think maybe the issue isn't so much negativity, but it is a friend of mine, Don the Pleb, had quote tweeted the essay, and he had said, well, one might call it re-enchantment, I call it motivation. And I thought that was a very good way of looking at it because, it is very easy to look at the screen or to listen to certain things and to be inundated with the idea that things are really bad and it doesn't seem like we can do much about it. And that's a very fair sort of conclusion to draw on. I mean, there's some definite, veterans of the scene, people who've been doing this for decades, who would have come to a similar conclusion that, there's not much left to do other than to just sort of, grin and bear it and bite the bullet and try and endure. And I think that leads to, similar to what you were describing in referencing Father Seraphim Rose, is sort of the sense of nihilism where there is just the desire to just not participate anymore. Morgoth's review had an essay, The Great Walking Away, where people are just done with it. Like, why bother? Why try?
Yeah.
Obviously, the system wants to just chew me up and spit me back out. So why bother with it? And I think that the reason why I wrote the essay is that, I had recently, that essay took forever. It originally started as like a 30-minute rant into my phone microphone as I was like walking around. And I was like, oh, the Substack transcription tool will help. And then that just sat there as I was like, well, how do I like lead this jumbled rant into something productive? But it did start because I went on a vacation towards the end of December over the New Year's. And just to see and meet and see parts of the South and to see like-minded people and to visit various parishes across the country. And my journey was just such a joy and delight to know that as bad as things are on the headlines, the average ordinary person that I would run into and talk to, I mean, there's still a great beauty to this country. There are still people that work and do really care about where the state of affairs are going. And like the rest of us, right, we're all just trying to get paid, take care of ourselves, take care of our families and so on. And the natural beauty itself too is a great pleasure and a great sense of re-enchantment for me because, I'm surrounded by nature all the time. I live in a very rural area. I live on some land with my family and help tend to taking care of it and all that. And so, I'm blessed in that respects to look around and see nature. But I also know that I'm attached to the 21st century equivalent of like John Dee's scrying mirror all the time, which is my phone, and which is Twitter and all other things that can really like warp your perception of the world. And at the same time, the internet is real life. Like the whole Twitter isn't real life meme. It is, but at the same time, it isn't the best, or maybe it is not the best hermeneutical tool to look at the world. And so with respects to re-enchantment and being motivated to take stock into what you have and to what to do, I think as Christians, we have it sort of the easiest, right? We have a command, to deny yourself, take up your cross and follow Christ. And at the same time, to be holy, right? And that's a daunting challenge for any man because that can only be accomplished with God. But, even if you don't choose that path, which is the correct path, but, there are people that are looking towards vitalism or techno-optimism or even neo-paganism. Everyone is looking for an answer. And it requires faith and it requires belief. And if you don't believe in anything and you're just standing there as a contrarian to what is currently going on in the world, I always reference the post-credit scene of Finding Nemo where like the band of fish, they all escape the dentist's office, they get in their little baggies, they roll across there, then the puffer fish is like, well, now what? Right? If you don't have an answer to the now what question, you need to have an answer sooner rather than later. And I think to have an answer to the now what question requires you to have faith in it, whatever it is you're doing, whether it's politics, local activism, working within your community. I mean, my parish and a bunch of other guys are trying a food cooperative with a bunch of other Orthodox parishes in the area. So, ways that we can feed ourselves in case things hit the fan. You have to work for it and you have to believe that what you're doing is worth something. And one of the things I've said as long as I started my channel, which has been almost 3.5 years ago now, is that if I can plant the vine and fig tree that my children will sit under and not be afraid, then my entire life has been worth it. And to be re-enchanted, to be remotivated, requires you to have faith to step out into the world and recognize that you have to take stock in what you have and to do it. And that's above all things, right, is to have faith and to keep our minds in a place where no matter how bad it gets, I still have to get up the next day and I still have to do what's right.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think there's this false dialectic or false dichotomy between you hear, oh, you're too online. And I do think it's possible. And I love that you referenced, because I can't stand that stupid saying, go touch grass. And you kind of made fun of it as well. And then it's like, well, if you're completely offline, there are a lot of things going on that I think are very valuable to understand. And there's discourse, and sure, it can make you upset or grumpy, like then, walk away and go do some other things. Do you see that as kind of a false dichotomy of like, either just completely erase Twitter and get offline and don't pay attention to anything that's going on, or just sitting there like, upset and fuming all day long looking at your timeline? It feels to me like there's some sort of path that you can it's both ands, as we say in Orthodoxy a lot.
Yeah, right. The royal path, I think, is somewhere in between. I reviewed with my lovely patrons and subscribers Marshall McLuhan's book Understanding Media, and he talks a lot about this idea that our technology, the global village and television, radio, etc., it creates a form of what he described as auto amputation. We earn into a way where so much information is being processed that we just try to go numb to it, or we try and cut off these sensory nerve endings so we don't feel so much about it. And I feel like on one instance, that auto amputation can also be described as being deterritorialized, to borrow from the postmodernists, because all of a sudden you're being uprooted from your language, your culture, your immediate surroundings, what's going on outside of your window, and nothing but what you see primarily in front of your phone screen matters. Now, the things that are happening online do matter, because today's tweets become tomorrow's news chyrons. They become the next, topic of discourse. I mean, I'll date this show very quickly. Right now, what's the discourse on the timeline? Well, everyone's talking about Starship Troopers, and it's ridiculous. We're having a conversation about quote unquote media literacy, but neither here nor there, right? Like that on one instance, that's dumb, but it's a great way to get your points in and to get your clout and whatever, because either you know why Starship Troopers looks based or whatever, or you're someone who's saying that you should sympathize with the literal brain-eating insects of Paul Verhoeven's movie, in which he didn't even read the book to make the film to begin with. And so the problem with this deterritorialization, and it's a problem that doesn't just Americans have these antibodies to it, because we were ground zero of the empire, right? We know what kind of weird things they're going to do, and so. A good example of this is I talked to a friend of mine on a semi-regular basis, Conscious Caracol, and Sven Seil over down in Afriforum in South Africa. And he told me this story one time where he was downtown and he heard someone that looks just like him, probably has, his ancestors been there as long as he has, but he's speaking perfect Americanized English. And I mean, that's an impressive cultural hegemonic tool where our lingua franca of the online space, just globally speaking, is sort of this Americanized English. The world sort of revolves around this discourse, and it's very hard to pay attention to the things that happen locally. And it does happen to us in the United States as well, to where we can be so invested in these faraway places and these faraway, discursive arguments and dichotomies that we kind of forget that, oh, hey, my city council meeting is going to have this discussion about putting up Section 8 housing somewhere soon. And that's a really bad idea. I should probably do something about it, because we do have a lot more power locally than we do on a federal level. But we get swept up in these grand political meta-narratives about what's going on. And it allows us to lose track very quickly of what's happening in our own backyard. And that encourages a lot of political illiteracy. A lot of the things that affect us day to day are on a state and local level. This isn't to say that the federal government doesn't matter. It absolutely does. But, there are things that are tangible that we can do that sometimes we become so, I call it digital deracination, that we're so cut off from the real world around us that the only thing that matters is online. And on one hand, the things that you do online do matter. Again, it's the royal path. You have to balance both. But if you're active online, you should also make the time to be active in your local community as well, especially if you're in a place where you can do something. I understand that, Many places in the city, that's not feasible. That's not possible for myriad of reasons. But I mean, if you live in the burbs or a rural area, or even in a smaller city or a district where you have a chance, you should go for it, because the things that you talk about online can make your world a better place in real life, and in vice versa. And the big issue is with this false dichotomy, or when people scream and say, touch grass. It's like, well, I already do that, and I'm active in my community. Like, what are you doing? Like, you're just raging at some, amphibious Twitter account saying that I'm evil or whatever, when instead, like, I'm going out of my way to ensure that, like, my fellow parishioners, we have access to farming equipment and food. I'm also, part of the local Republican Party in my county. I do community service. Like, what more do you want from me? But apparently I'm not touching grass enough. So there's the royal path is somewhere in between.
You use a term in the Re-Enchantment piece that you wrote called civilizational bottleneck. Can you talk about what you mean by that, and maybe how we've gotten to this point?
Sure. So that's based off of sort of one of those unscripted rants I like to do on occasion. So, like, if anyone goes to my YouTube channel, you'll see three or four primary mainstays. So one of them is the show called The Digital Archipelago that I host. Another thing that I do are these unscripted videos called Reel Talks, REEL Talks. And that's where I go fishing and I just voice over some rant that's been on my head. It's a very easy way to get ideas out when I'm too lazy to write an essay. And the civilizational bottleneck, or what I called it was the bottleneck wars, is that there's been a lot of discussion, rightfully so, over fertility, our processed foods, industrial farming, microplastics, and the rest. I mean, guys like right nationalists and so on have been at the forefront of calling these things out. And it's very good that you are, because so much of what we eat and what we wear and what we do is bad for the human body. To a point where a friend of mine, Bennett's Phylactery, who works with the Exit Group, when he had hosted last December in Texas, I think in Austin, the Natalist Conference, how do we increase native birth rates? How do we get people to actually have children? Because, contrary to Elric's book about the population bomb, we're actually going to have a huge depopulation because people are just not having kids and the fertility rate is down. And people were calling it far right and fascist and whatever. Like, it's an actual civilizational human-wide problem.
Right. Yeah.
And so what I mean by bottleneck is that we're in a genetic bottleneck. I mean, how many people are actually having children and passing on their genes and passing on their bloodline and their family names? I mean, we see this especially when there's reports about Gen Z or men and women. The men are far more conservative versus the women being far more progressive. And that makes it very difficult for pair bonding and relationships to happen. We have technological filters as well. Or, I mean, there are plenty of people that will happily accept the passions and will happily be okay with the pornography or the AI chatbot.
Yes.
I mean, the fantasy in the movies, right? Like of the girl next door.
Yep.
Well, the girl next door is still accessible. You can just buy her for $8 a month on OnlyFans, and that's incredibly depressing.
Yep.
So those things are part of the civilizational bottleneck. We now live in a bottleneck where there are active forces that are wishing to cancel writers, books, statues, etc. So how much of the great American canon can we actually read or understand? And I had this conversation this last Sunday at church, as I said, most of the American canon of great works of literature aren't really accessible to people nowadays, because unless you're scripturally literate and you know your Bible, you can't understand half the things the great American authors are saying. My favorite William Faulkner novel is Absalom, Absalom. You can't read that book unless you know who Absalom is and you know your Old Testament. Like you just can't. And so again, these bottlenecks occur where we're in a high pressure selection environment where very few people are going to pass through this bottleneck filter. And so this requires us to be very serious about, well, can we get our young people married? Can we create businesses and institutions that are anti-fragile, that can get people employed and give people a reason to will to live? Do we re-enchant the world in a way that brings them back to the good, the true, and the beautiful? Mm-hmm. And can we ensure that all these things survive against selection pressures that are dysgenic, anti-civilizational, and suicidal? And I've said it more often than I care to count, but progressivism is suicidal ideation on a civilizational scale. And the question is what are we doing to make sure you don't put the bullet to your brain? And that's really our main goal when it comes to a civilizational bottleneck, is how do we survive and what do we need to do in order to survive? That way, 200 years from now, someone can look back and say like, oh yeah, William Faulkner, a great, 20th century American writer.
Yeah. What do you think's led to this fertility crisis? And I mean, that's a very broad question. I get that, and I want to maybe pinpoint. Do you believe that it's been, let's say, on purpose?
Well, there's certainly a lot of things that would indicate that it's on purpose. Whether it be, I think it was from the Wall Street Journal just a few weeks ago where they were talking about the population bomb, that book in the 70s, and someone was like, I believed the hysteria and I didn't have kids and now I'm older and I regret it.
Right.
I mean, people do fall for that sort of stuff. Another one, of course, is that there was, I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but I think it was from Pew Research Center or something like that, where it's talking about that there's a significant, more than a statistically significant percentage of people in the United States that aren't having children because of climate change, which on one hand, you've been filtered, and if you have progressive beliefs, you filtered yourself. So I guess in some way that's a self-licking ice cream cone I don't have to worry about.
Right.
But at the same time, it does illustrate that we are very susceptible to ideas and machinations that don't want us to have children. I mean, we do, of course, in America, we consume things that are inherently bad for our bodies, in endocrine disruptors.
Mm-hmm.
I think who I wish I knew the philosopher's name, but he had said that to an extent that when the archaeologists of the future go through this century, it's going to just be when they do the drill boreholes into the ground, it's just going to be 36 feet worth of plastic that consumes our fossil record. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we've made a great Faustian bargain with a lot of the things that we consume in that respect as well. So some of this, of course, is by accident of our technological progress. Paul Virilio, the French philosopher, would say that for every new invention, we invent the corresponding accident that comes with that. So we invent the train. So by extension, we invent the first train derailment.
Yes.
We invent plastic. We invent the biological side effects of that. So I think that some of this, of course, is definitely pressured on us. I mean, immigration reduces the fertility of the native-born population. We saw this when Donald Trump got elected, that there was a spike in white fertility in the United States and a decrease in immigrant population fertility, and this to the same degree that it would be if they got unemployed. So when people don't have hope, people have other ways to spend their time and money, and we encourage a culture where the average idea of being young and with children is so antithetical. I mean, I think Billy Pratt tweeted this out a while ago, but it's just how much damage did the television show Teen Mom do, to say that young people having children is a bad thing. Now, it should be, of course, within the confines of marriage and all that jazz. But I mean, the average age of marriage has skyrocketed from the late teens, early 20s from 50 years ago to where most people get married in their mid to late 20s and have children around the same time. So we've wasted all these years of perfectly good fertile health. And the explosion of the pill, sexual liberation. I mean, there's just so many issues to say it's a combination of man-made and, top-down pressures to say don't have kids. That's very verbose and ranty. I apologize to your listeners, but I mean,
that was great.
It's a myriad of issues.
Yeah. I completely agree. You talk about vitalism in this piece that we're discussing as being one of the sort of reactions to the downfall of this civilizational process we're seeing. What I want my listeners to understand, and I know you're going to say, well, this is my take on it, and that's completely fine. That's what I want. What is vitalism, and what's it have to offer? And then we can talk about possible downfalls if you'd like.
Sure. So I think and again, like you had said, this is sort of my understanding of it. But to me, vitalism is this attempt to breathe fresh air into our current system. I mean, if you look at the sort of the status quo of stodgy academic politics, left or right, there is this sort of inherently, as it's been called, the bug man, right? The person that just goes about their day, enjoys their little life luxuries, collects their Funko Pops, or enjoys their avocado toast. We have these stereotypes of these people. And in turn, they're not living an exciting life. They're not doing anything that promotes strength. We're actively told that, rather than solve the problem, just medicate the problem away. I mean, Ozempic's a really great example of this, or whatever the technical term for the drug is, right? That instead of, actually lifting weights and taking care of yourself and being disciplined, just to take the injection, take a pill, do something about that instead. And so we live in a society that is so afraid of adventure. We live in a society that is afraid of dying. We live in a society that is afraid of life. I mean, COVID is a perfect example of this, right? I mean, the West has been so immunized against mortality due to our technological advances that even though the coup ended up not really being anything, right? It was for the average person, like, oh man, people are actually dying in mass. What do I need to do something about it?
Yes.
And so instead, there are people today that are still wearing masks and are indicating that they must be zero coup-related stuff. And a whole cult of these people who just think it's the end times. Whereas the average person has sort of moved on from it. But to me, vitalism is the idea that we must be strong, we must be returning to some kind of position of strength where we must believe that we can conquer, we can do things. It is a can-do type deal. A lot of this, of course, is inspired by a Bronze Age pervert in his book Bronze Age Mindset and the people that sort of follow him. Not really in his camp, but a lot of the people in that camp are kind to me, and I think they have some good insights as well, that we should reject sort of the stodgy academic Christianity of like the establishment conservative movement.
Yes.
We should be avoiding the sort of National Review style of just economic focuses on taxes and things like that matter. You need to give people a reason to live, and you should be reading people that talk about that sort of Nietzschean concept, the will to power. We have to overcome the world. We have to defeat it. We have to make sure that we do not become the last man who looks towards the stars and doesn't understand why they're there or why it's a beautiful scene. And that I think it has a lot to offer in the sense that we have been so shackled by, just do what you have to do, don't speak up. I mean, you need to focus on the issues that really matter. And then the issues that allegedly really matter are issues that don't affect me, but a small, rich portion of the country that has nothing to do with like flyover America or anything like that, which is the majority of people who vote Republican anyway. And so I think that there is a lot there where people have tried to synthesize how it works within Christianity or how it works within techno-optimism or so on. But just to call people out and say, listen, you're a quote unquote skinny fat person who sits in an office job and doesn't do anything with his life. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Isn't that sad? Don't you want to be more than that? And I think that's a totally righteous thing to call out because we should be better than that. And I mean, especially since you and I are both Orthodox Christians, like we should be fasting. We should be taking care of our bodies. We should be watchful about what we eat, what we do. We should be healthy and strong and fit to carry our brother and so on and so forth. And to me, I feel like it's both a political but the sort of metaphysical mindset in which we should overcome the weakness of the world. I mean, obviously from falling testosterone levels to the rise of, I mean, if you want to call it like the new male or just like, the physiognomy checking of the profile picture, right? You're just like, I can clearly tell when I look at someone like, okay, I know your politics just by judging the book by its cover. Yeah. And like, as terrible as that might be, like it's gotten to a point where it's like true 80% of the time. And I should do something about it. And I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be the bug man. I want to be strong. I want to be something more than that. And that has its problems with pride, of course. But, you can and we should, look at the world around us and know that, hey, this world is awful. This world is evil. Like the progressive spirit of the age is terrible. We should be the opposite of that. We should be strong. We should be encouraging growth, learning, development. And we should say no to the idea of, well, why don't you just settle for this? Well, why, and it goes back to the oldest sales pitch in the world is why settle when you can be better? It's the perennial sales pitch of all ages. And it works most of the time because especially nowadays, because you look at the world and you're like, well, no, I don't want to marry like the overweight, blue-haired chick that works at Barnes & Noble. I want something better than that.
Right. Yeah. And often, I mean, I'm stereotyping, but it's because I've seen it. Yeah, that type of female you just described, you often look at the male that she's with and you can see what we just discussed as well. Yeah. And I think maybe to avoid the pride or the vanity aspect of some of this, because that's a very easy pitfall to fall into, and I'm guilty of it myself at times. But to be strong and a real man, I would say, it's not to go out there and think that you look better than everyone else, or go and unfortunately I've done this when I was younger, but bully people physically and push someone like these beta males around is to be able to protect the people that you love, and meekness, being able to defend someone and defend yourself, but not necessarily be on the offensive about it. That's just my small take on some of these things. If you have any response to that, you can.
No, I think that there's truth to that. I mean, after all, I have a plank in my own eye. I shouldn't be too mindful about my brother's speck, right? But I do think sometimes that when, and at least in the Christian context, for being vitalistic. I mean, this is why the camaraderie of your brothers and sisters in Christ is so important. I mean, I'm very blessed that the parish I go to has a lot of men that are relatively my age, and we can talk about our struggles and talk about how, about prayer or whatever. And it allows us to be more disciplined in what we're focused on, of course, in our day-to-day Christian lives. And that's a good thing to have. And I mean, even if some of your members of your audience aren't Christian, I mean, you should be able to form those bonds with your neighbors, or whatever sort of community activism, or not even activism, just like, what are your hobbies, right? Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone is a great example of this. I mean, the destruction of the third place, it's all this disembodied, extra-dimensional, digital astral plane of social media. And when you take this, what I call digital ayahuasca, like the social media, the everything like that, we're disembodied from the physical world. And in doing so, it prevents us from having real-life friends. And this is why I tell a lot of my audience members, to a point where people repeat it back to me, that when you turn off your phone at night and you look into the reflection of your black phone screen and you don't like what you're seeing, clearly you have something to work on. But if you don't have people around you, or you don't have the discipline to actually go and fix the problem, you're going to be caught in this feedback loop of self-destruction, and you're going to get filtered out of the world, and faith as well as relationships and so on like that. So I think it becomes very important for us to have, and again, it's sort of also what the Vitalists talk about. They refer to it in sort of that Indo-European, the Korios, the group of young men that would like leave the group and then settle and conquer somewhere else. But I mean, even in a context of the Korios, like a camaraderie with friends, and especially male friendship, has been so destroyed and so warped that being able to tell my friend, "Hey man, I love you," is now seen as like a homosexual act by most progressives. I mean, whether they've corrupted,
they would celebrate that part of it, but yeah.
Of course, they would celebrate it as a great, homosexual form of liberation, but not in the fact that I love my friend because I love my friend.
Right.
It's the same thing that they do with the classics, right? They'll talk about Achilles or Patroclus, and they'll talk about the ancient Greeks being gay, and it's just like, well, no, not at all. You just are. Not to do the whole ontologically evil meme, but like, you are metaphysically incapable of understanding that there can be love between two men that has nothing to do with the idea that I want to bum this person.
Yes, right.
That's the great tragedy of it all. And so, yeah, absolutely. We need to find ways in which we can be with strong men and strong bonds that help us, stay on the right path.
What are your thoughts? And again, I'm looking at this through the lens of what I would broadly call our circles. And so I'm not specifically saying like there's a left wing, I'm not talking about like the people that we don't see online, let's say on our timelines, but this discourse between males and females. What are your thoughts on this back and forth, this trad con? And I know you know what I'm referring to, so I'll kind of let you take it.
I feel like whoever actually figures out a solution to this, right, is like king of the space forever.
Yeah.
In the same way, whichever like tech bro startup company removes microplastics out of the blood of American men is king of America forever. I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you. And I mean, this is some people have their own ways and means of joking about it. I mean, there of course is some form of men going their own way, which I think has a myriad of problems because men and women are meant to be together.
Right.
But at the same time, we shouldn't be settling for, the average in ourselves. We should be setting up standards, but we should also be realistic about it. And with respects to say like the gender discourse, it does help that we, I think both sides of the sexes kind of acknowledge that there is a great problem that one of the things too, I mean, just for average people, people in our spaces talk about it as well, is that a lot of people just look at relationships either as very transactional, and this has been brought on by, I think, a huge generational divide. Because if you do something for your friend and you do it out of love, like I don't expect anything in return.
Right.
Whereas for a lot of people nowadays, you do something nice for them and they're like, well, what's your angle? They look at you with this innate skepticism. We don't trust anyone. I mean, that's a consequence of living in a low trust civilization. But I mean, even people my age and younger, they'll ask you for your Venmo or Cash App because they want to pay you back. And so, because we look at things transactionally and we look at things also with an open door, dating apps are a really great example. I mean, like Tinder or whatever. I mean, great. You're now applying a homosexual mating strategy towards heterosexual couples of just having as many options as possible and just moving on to the next person if you don't like what you see.
Right.
And so this idea that we can just move on, we look at everything transactionally. And then of course, we live in a society where we basically have determined which person gets to unload the gun, so to speak. I mean, the pills have really, is the ultimate example. It's done more damage than the atom bomb, really, on a civilizational scale, because all of a sudden, one part of the human, species, the female sex now can determine and control when they want to get pregnant. Men can't really control that. They talk about male birth control. It hasn't happened yet. But I mean, now we've liberated women to such a degree where, it used to be the whole Sex and the City type deal, and it was like HBO's Girls, and now it's just the sort of party lifestyle and so on. We've encouraged a behavior, just an onset rapid behavior for both men and women, that the idea of commitment or getting pregnant is the worst possible thing that could ever happen to you. And we've just destroyed all forms of pair bonding whatsoever. And again, this goes back to the sort of civilizational bottleneck that we're in. Like, well, whoever actually gets married and survives, like, congratulations, you've survived this generation. Can you instill values and institutions and traditions that survive the next one? Because anything that we do politically, right, we shouldn't be thinking about our kids or grandkids. We need to be thinking 6 generations ahead. And we've totally thrown that concept out the window. And we've also thrown out any form of traditional pair bonding whatsoever. And I mean, I think it was saying like millennials were having less sex than their parents' generation did. And I'm sure it's the same case for Zoomers. Not to mention women are quote unquote having more sex than the men are. Women make more money than the men do. We've totally inverted and just thrown out the idea that patriarchy is a good thing.
Yes.
And I mean, whether in a Christian context or even in a secular one, like the consequences of that have been devastating. So, I mean, whatever political formula that repackages and reintroduces patriarchy in a way where the men can be the head of the household again, men can do this. Until that gets solved, I don't know how that problem gets actually addressed, because those things are decades-long problems that we have been encouraging and willing participants in. I mean, unless you're already married and you have kids, then like, congratulations, that's not so much your problem. But now you have to watch out for your son. Now you have to watch out for your daughter and so on. And it's now, it's a problem bigger than ever because, and I mean, COVID did a lot of damage to that too. I mean, everyone was so locked in, everyone's so online. The idea of going to coffee bars or whatever, like to find people, like, well, people just stopped going out and people just stopped doing those things. So, whoever reintroduces ways to get the kids back to meeting each other, right? That happens. But so much of it is digital now, and it's here to stay, whether we like it or not. So,
I agree.
Whether it's Peter Thiel's The Right Stuff, conservative dating app, which I think everyone rolled their eyes at when that was unveiled. But something has to be done, both institutionally, but also, I mean, it requires discernment. Like, if you're going to have a community, if you're going to have an organization or whatever, you're not going to have someone who's like, quote unquote, cruising to find a wife or whatever. Like, you need to trust their values, their judgment, and so on. And I mean, this is why it's so important for anyone. And I mean, for us, it's a little easier because we're in Christian communities where, there's a long catechizing process. There's easy ways to filter out the good men and the bad men, or the good women and the bad women. But on a regular in the world scale, that's all but gone. And that's a big destruction, is the destruction of patriarchy, the inversion of gender, I don't want to say supremacy, but the distortion of where men and women's natural roles are in the world. And because of all that, we have made it all but impossible for pair bonding to be successful. I mean, marriage is happening later and later in life. People look at marriage as just a piece of paper. They don't see any value to it. And we've basically are witnessing the same kind of familial destruction that the Black community saw after the Great Society, where the Black middle class was just utterly eviscerated, and we just subsidized the most animalistic behavior possible. Like, we're witnessing the same thing for everybody else, and it's all catching up to us. And again, that's part of the bottleneck.
Yes, well put. And this, I think I've heard even what I would call traditional or Christian females that have, like, you can't overestimate how far and deep and wide the tentacles of feminism or this modern culture can go. I've heard women that would say, oh, I'm a Christian, or I'm traditional, or I'm conservative, say, well, I'm not going to be a man's slave. And it's like that thought is, it's just so, I mean, it sounds like it's straight out of 1967 or something like that. But it's kind of where we're at now. And even it's like the everything's been pushed so far left that if someone that says, well, I'm right, it's like, well, you're the right side of this left-wing spectrum or this feminist worldview. And it's wild.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, even if they call themselves trad or whatever, they'll look at women who are healthy housewives and take care of kids like they're that one woman in the Stepford Wives where she goes to the town and she sees all the women acting like zombies, even though they're just like regular housewives, which of course is a feminist horror story. And,
yes.
And a big part of it too is that the aesthetic of quote unquote traditionalism has just been turned into a form of softcore pornography.
Right.
I mean, the whole, girl in the wheat fields with the blue sundress or whatever. I mean, people who are just dressing nice and trying to reappropriate it. I mean, it's just a part of a female dating strategy or a female way to get male eyes on themselves. And so it's, again, that sort of narcissistic pick-me attitude. Mm-hmm. And that comes across in traditionalism or what you would call trad. And so I think it can be very easy for people to fall into the trap of, oh, well, she's look at how modest she dresses. And it's like, well, not really. I mean, if she were modest, right, like she wouldn't be trying to like show off her chest to you, in the dress, right? Like, I get it. You're appealing to the male brain's passions and so forth. And unfortunately, it's just putting on a new window dressing. The problem hasn't been covered up yet. I mean, the same thing with a lot of our technological advances is that they just simply are a very powerful myrrh or powerful perfume or oil that covers up the rotting stench of our social decline. And unless our technology and our social techniques match in terms of values, there's always going to be this huge disconnect. And people are going to be incapable of successful pair bonding and marriage and child rearing. And I mean, it's a big reason why the whole rural-urban divide discourse is kind of faded away to some extent. Like, it flares up on Twitter every now and then. But I mean, I live in a very rural place where the kids dress like country kids, right? Mm-hmm. Like, kids ride their horses and so on to the park or whatever, and they go on ATVs and go shooting and whatever. They talk like any other Zoomer that you would see on the internet, just with a little bit of a Southern accent. Mm-hmm. And so the internet has pierced the geography. And so, again, if our social technology, marriage or institutions or religious or cultural values, if they have this huge disconnect with the technology, well, the technology can subsume that and eat it up and corrode it like acid to steel. And that's a big part of the problem where we're at is that we just don't have ways to, provide some sort of protective covering over it, or better yet, we don't really control the technology and the places where that technology gets invented for its usage. And that's a big issue is that it's going to require discernment, and it's going to require, just straight up gatekeeping, which we don't do because social media is semi-permeable membranes all over the place. This quote unquote space of ours or scene of ours, even if there's a one bad apple, right? And everyone disavows it except one person, that one bad apple is still in the space.
Yes. Why do you think there's been at least we can call it minor, in some places it's more than minor. There's about to be what I would consider, I can't say this in all fairness, but I think a hit piece coming out in Texas Monthly on the explosion of orthodoxy in Texas. But even more broadly speaking than Texas, why do you think there's been a explosion, even if it's minor and relatively speaking, in Orthodox Christianity?
I think it came out of the sort of desire to return to some religion in the midst of COVID in 2020. There was a great writer. Her name is Tara Isabella Burton, and she wrote an article in early 2020 called "Christianity It's Weird" in the New York Times. And she's wrote a recent book called "Self-Made" about how we perceive ourselves in terms of identity. It's a really good book. I would recommend that you read it. I think you'd enjoy it. I can send it to you as a PDF after the show. But she was just talking about how people were kind of coming back to Christianity in the midst of, encountering it. Like I mentioned earlier with the whole Kuth thing, people were encountering their own mortality and people wanted to get their answers. And I'm just as much a product of that. I kind of got hit doubly with it because I was going through kidney failure at the same time as the whole Kuth thing was going on. So dealing with dialysis and eventually a transplant later on was just like, I should probably get right with my creator before I, slip this mortal coil, heaven forbid. And in doing so, I started looking towards, Christianity, and a lot of other people did as well. I think they sort of quote unquote explosion, or I haven't read the Texas Monthly, piece.
It's not quite out yet. It might be by the time this episode drops, but
I'll have to read it, maybe write a response or react to it. Who knows? But
yes,
my journey back to Christianity was going to all sorts of different churches, and I went to the traditional Latin Mass. I went to Anglican churches. I went to Southern Baptist churches, like my grandmother was. I didn't really grow up with religion just as an army brat, because you really had two services, either the Roman Catholic Novus Ordo Mass, or you had just a non-denominational Protestant service that was like functionally Baptist. And it was more of an officers, wives club, where it's like, oh, I didn't see you there last Sunday. And so there was no emphasis on Christ or anything like that. Even the Easter services, or just be a bunch of military chaplains in their class A's, sort of talking about, oh, he's risen. But there was no, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to say Christ is risen? Like there was nothing there. So I didn't really grow up with it. And it made me functionally agnostic for years.
Yes.
And in doing so, it brought me back. And I think the reason why there's been an explosion in Orthodoxy, I think, has been a myriad of factors. I think that, one, there has been just sort of this great disillusionment to see a lot of mainline Protestant churches. I mean, the Methodist Church is split between the Free Methodists and the United Methodist Church. My aunt is part of that. And, when their church voted to not support homosexual marriage, the legal stuff they had to go through just to keep their church building and their money from the United Methodist Church, and to listen to people basically get kicked out of churches that have been founded for over 200 years.
Wow.
Was really disheartening to hear. And so I think that left a lot of people disillusioned. I think it also meant that people had some disillusionment with Catholicism, especially with under the current magisterium. But again, not my ecclesial circus, not my ecclesial monkeys. I'm not going to judge our Catholic brethren in this instance. I know that there are plenty of good, faithful Catholics, but neither here nor there. As for me, it was looking for options in respects to, well, what is Christianity in a sense where it's not just scripture, or it's not just feel good, the whole moral therapeutic deism thing that's just ruled America since the 1990s and later on. I mean, ever since we got rid of, I would say really since the 60s, with prayer being written out of schools and atheism taking over. And so for me, it was a friend of mine who was Greek Orthodox, and he had converted when he was in high school. And he had told me, he says, well, why don't you reread the book of Acts? And then tell me what do you think about that? And so I did. And I was like, okay, well, clearly, I said, well, what happened? And then I asked him, like, what happened afterward? Because, there's those Acts 29 churches that are Protestant. And he says, well, why don't you read, the Fathers or whatever? And so I did. And so one of the earliest things I read was St. John Cassian out of the Philokalia. And I just like, okay, this is way more hardcore than, things I hear out of, on my timeline, or out of even, my religious family members' mouths. And so I said, I should look into this. And I went to a liturgy on Zacchaeus Sunday several years ago, actually. So not by the anniversary that just passed, actually, but at the time of this recording. And after hearing it, I was like, this is where God is. This is God's house. And I never looked back. As for why other people are doing it, I think it is because we've become so uprooted from their own Protestant traditions, and people want to know where Christ is.
Yes. Well put. Well put. In closing here, give us white pill or two, and for my audience that says, Buck always says these weird phrases, something optimistic to look forward to?
I think something to look forward to is that there is so much opportunity. There's so much fertile ground, whether it is for evangelization or to establish groups, clubs, and to meet like-minded people. One of the great things in my sort of space is that there has been sort of a de-emphasization of the online space and communities and focusing on meeting people in real life and having conferences and talking to people like that. I can break bread with someone where I don't have to try and gauge where their politics are. I can just cut through all the weeds and this man speaks my language. I'm good to go. And there's a great pleasure in that because it's lovely to meet your mutuals in real life or to meet with like-minded men in person. And so I think that the real opportunity or the real white pill is that there is so much, rich land that is fertile, that is waiting to be, for your oats to be sown, so to speak. Not in a sexual context, obviously. I know that term has other connotations, but there's so much to be done. And there's a lot of reason to be optimistic because it's okay, things are bad, but there are a lot of other people around you that know things are awful.
Yes.
And, if the world was changed by Christ and 12 men, his disciples, obviously, you and 12 other guys can get a lot done in terms of business or cooperatives or meeting like-minded people in person. Just to see organizations like New Founding exist, right? To help with, community projects, whether it be their plans for buying homes in Appalachia or helping find people get employment so where they're not going to be fired if they believe that a man is a man and not a woman. That's a huge step in the right direction. Now, yes, things can and potentially most likely will get worse. The question though is what are you doing in the meantime? This goes back to what I said in my video about meteorologists for the eschaton. The master wants to see you working. Are you going to stand there and bury your one talent in the ground? Or are you going to try and make, 2 talents or 5 talents more? And that's the biggest thing to take away from this is that now is the time to take those talents and to make something of them. Because if you don't, well, we already know how that story goes.
Mm-hmm. All right. Plug away. Plug anything you'd like. Substack, Twitter, podcast, all of it.
Sure. So again, my name is The Prudentialist. I also go by Matthew online. That's also my baptismal name. You can find me on YouTube, Telegram, Twitter, Substack. The rest, just look for The Frog and The Prudentialist. I have a great little website called Find My Friends, FRENS.net/The Prudentialist. You can find all of my links there. I am most commonly on YouTube, Twitter, and Substack. I am currently going through the entirety of Sean McMeekin's 2021 book, Stalin's War, A New History of World War II, with various friends and guests. So if you want to have a better understanding of just how evil Stalin was and how corrupt and inept FDR was, by all means, go ahead and tune into that. I host a show every Thursday called The Digital Archipelago with my good friend Gio Penichetti, where we cover, internet culture, what's going on in the news, as well as various forms of the arts and so on. So if you're interested in that, by all means, tune in. And I myself write on Substack, theprudentialist.substack.com, and I write for the Old Glory Club. So go and check us out there. And Buck, thank you so much for having me on.
You're welcome, Matthew, The Prudentialist. It's been an honor, and I'm glad we finally did this, and I know we'll do it again. Thanks, man.
Likewise, buddy. Take care.
All right. Thanks to our favorite frogman, our favorite Orthodox Christian frogman, The Prudentialist, for dropping by and chatting with us here on Counterflow. I love his material. Again, I love his content. As for us, counterflowpodcast.com. Follow me on Twitter at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. Have fun with us in the Telegram group. Just go to the Telegram app and search for Counterflow with Buck Johnson. You will find it. And of course, the episodes drop every Tuesday evening on the YouTube channel. We're also on Rumble and Odyssey. Subscribe to that YouTube channel, and that'll help you get all of the notifications that you need. We had a wonderful, wonderful time with Father Moses McPherson on the last Patreon Zoom for my Patreon supporters. To not miss one of these, to take part in one of these, just go to patreon.com/counterflow. $5 donation or more per month gets you in the group where once a month we have private Zoom calls with all of you, myself, and a special guest. It's a wonderful time. I highly recommend it. And like I always tell you, every penny I make from you guys through that Patreon group goes right back in to the production of this show, which is not free, but it's the best. So I want to keep that going. And until next week, you guys have a good one. God bless.
You get split in half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.